June 3, 1944. Portsmouth, England. Eddie Kowalski stood in the rain, staring at 2,000 silent tanks that were supposed to change the world in 36 hours. But 847 of them sat there like tombstones, dead, useless. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Somewhere in that briefing room, General Eisenhower was reading a report that said the invasion might have to be delayed, or worse, launched with half the armor they'd promised those boys on the beaches. Eddie had built these transmissions, every single one, back in Detroit on the night shift, his hands moving faster than his thoughts. He'd warned his supervisor about the spring modification, told him it would fail in mud. The supervisor had laughed. "Leave the engineering to the engineers, Kowalski." Now Eddie was standing in front of 20 officers who looked at him like he was insane. "Sir, I think I can fix them, all of them, in 36 hours. The room went so quiet, Eddie could hear his own heartbeat. He wasn't sure if he was about to save the invasion or destroy his life. But he knew one thing: those boys loading onto ships deserved better than a tank that wouldn't move when the ramp dropped. Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more untold stories where ordinary people made impossible choices. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. These stories belong to all of us. June 2, 1944, 1400 hours. Ray Torres had been a tank mechanic long enough to know what silence meant. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that made your stomach drop. He walked down the line of Sherman tanks, their fresh invasion stripes still smelling like paint. Beautiful machines, ready for war, except tank. A 247 was cold, dead cold. Torres climbed through the commander's hatch, dropped into the driver's seat, and turned the key. Nothing. He tried again, still nothing. A sick feeling crawled up his throat. He moved to the next tank. Same thing. And the next. And the next. By the time he called it in, Torres had checked 200 tanks, 147 failures. His hand shook when he picked up the field phone. This wasn't just a mechanical problem. This was thousands of soldiers who were about to land on a beach without the armor they'd been promised. "This is Torres, Sector 7, his voice cracked. "We have a problem." The briefing room smelled like wet wool and cigarette smoke. 20 officers crowded around a map table, their faces showing that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from making decisions that cost lives. Lieutenant Colonel James Ashford stood at the head of the table. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 3 days. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. 847 Sherman tanks, transmission failure. That's 42% of our armored force. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? The engineers say it's a manufacturing defect. Complete transmission replacement required. Minimum 8 days for parts from the States. A British officer's voice cut through the silence. "D-Day is in 36 hours. "I know." The room erupted, not with anger, with the desperate mathematics of men trying to calculate how many soldiers would die without those tanks, how many mothers would get telegrams, how many kids would grow up without fathers. That's when Eddie stood up. He hadn't meant to, hadn't planned it, but sitting there listening to them talk about replacement parts and impossible timelines, something inside him broke. "Sir, I disagree with the engineering assessment." Every head turned. Eddie saw their faces, the confusion, the irritation. Who was this greasy civilian in coveralls speaking up in a command briefing? Ashford's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Eddie Kowalski, sir. Detroit Arsenal." His voice steadied. "I built those transmissions. 4,000 of them. And I know what's wrong." Eddie had never spoken to a general before, never addressed a room full of colonels. His hands were sweating, but his voice stayed calm. "It's not a manufacturing defect, sir. It's a design flaw. January 1943, someone at Army Ordnance decided the synchronizer springs needed tighter tolerances. Sounded good on paper, but nobody tested them in European mud." He pulled out a crumpled sketch from his pocket. The paper was stained with grease and coffee. He'd drawn it at 3 a.m. 6 months ago, trying to explain to his supervisor why the modification was wrong. The springs are grinding themselves apart. But the fix isn't replacement, it's adjustment. 20 minutes per tank if you know what you're doing. An Army captain laughed, but there was no humor in it. One man. 847 tanks? 36 hours? That's not possible. Eddie looked at him. It's possible if you let me train mechanics. 200 men working in teams, 23 tanks per hour. We finish with time to spare. Ashford studied Eddie's face, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for the crack that would tell him this civilian was bluffing. He didn't find it. If you're wrong, tank crews die. This entire operation fails. I know, sir. Eddie's voice dropped to almost a whisper. That's why I'll be on one of those tanks. First wave. If I'm wrong, I die with them. He hadn't planned to say that. The words just came. But the moment they left his mouth, Eddie knew they were true. He couldn't send boys into battle in tanks he'd fixed unless he was willing to trust his own work with his life. General Bradley arrived 20 minutes later. He listened to the whole thing without speaking, then turned to Eddie with eyes that had seen too many young men die. You're confident? Yes, sir. Why? Eddie thought about his supervisor laughing at him. Thought about all the times assembly workers got ignored because they didn't have engineering degrees. Thought about the boys loading onto ships who trusted their equipment would work. Because I built these, sir. And I know what the manuals don't say. Bradley nodded once. 36 hours. Don't waste them. June 2nd, 2100 hours. 200 mechanics stood in the motor pool garage, looking at Eddie like he was either a genius or a lunatic. Most of them were exhausted. All of them were skeptical. Eddie understood. He'd have been skeptical too. He held up a wrench. Just a standard combination wrench. Nothing special. The kind of tool you could find in any garage. This is what saves the invasion, he said quietly. Not fancy equipment, not engineering degrees. This, and your willingness to trust that sometimes the manual is wrong. A young mechanic in the front row raised his hand. Sir, the technical manual says... The manual was written by people who never built these transmissions, Eddie interrupted. I did. 4,000 times. I argued against the modification that's killing these tanks. Nobody listened. Now we're here. He picked up a synchronizer spring, held it up so they could all see. This spring is too tight. Whoever designed it thought tighter meant stronger. But in Norman mud, tight means friction. Friction means heat. Heat means failure. Eddie set the spring down gently, like it was something precious. In a way, it was. This tiny piece of metal was the difference between success and failure, between life and death. I'm going to show you how to fix this. Once. Then you're going to do it 846 more times. Some of you won't sleep. Most of you won't eat. All of you will hurt. He paused, meeting their eyes. But every tank you fix might save 5 lives. Maybe more. An older sergeant stepped forward. Mike DeLuca. Brooklyn accent, calloused hands, the look of a man who'd spent his life working with machines. Show us, DeLuca said simply. Eddie worked on the transmission like he was performing surgery. Every movement deliberate, every adjustment precise, 18 minutes start to finish. When the engine fired up, running smooth and strong, he saw something change in their faces, not belief, not yet, but possibility. Now we do it again, Eddie said. And again. Until we've saved 847 tanks or run out of time, whichever comes first. The first hours were chaos, mechanics fumbling with unfamiliar procedures, tools dropping, mistakes requiring do-overs. Eddie moved between teams, correcting, teaching, demonstrating. His voice got hoarse from repeating the same instructions. But somewhere around hour 3, something magical happened. The mechanics found their rhythm. DeLuca and a young private named Tommy Chen had turned their 2-man team into a precision machine, 16 minutes per tank. No wasted motion, no wasted words. Spring tension, 15% reduction. Clutch, 0.2 offset. Good. Eddie watched them work and felt something he hadn't expected. Pride. These men had been strangers 4 hours ago. Now they moved like they'd been working together for years, but not everyone was succeeding. At Tank C-304, Eddie found a team that had over-adjusted the spring tension. The transmission would work fine for a few hours, then fail catastrophically under combat stress. He made them tear it apart and start over. The lead mechanic looked like he was about to cry. Kid couldn't have been more than 20. "Sir, we've been working for 4 hours straight. This tank," Eddie said quietly, "goes to Omaha Beach. 5 men inside. You send them in with a bad transmission, it fails under fire, they can't move. They get hit. All 5 dead." He put his hand on the kid's shoulder. "I'm not being cruel. I'm being honest. Their lives depend on your precision. So tear it apart and do it right." The kid nodded, swallowed hard, and got back to work. Eddie walked away feeling like he'd just sentenced someone to torture. But there was no room for kindness when perfection was the only thing that kept people alive. June 3rd, 0800 hours. 10 hours in, 412 tanks fixed, 435 to go. Eddie was running on coffee and adrenaline, his hands shaking from exhaustion. That's when Torres found him with news that made his stomach drop. Tank D556. Stripped threads on the housing. Eddie's blood ran cold. A stripped housing meant the whole transmission was compromised, unfixable. They just lost a tank. When he got there, 2 mechanics sat beside the ruined tank, covered in grease, looking defeated. One of them was young, maybe 19, with the kind of scared eyes that come from knowing you've made an irreversible mistake. "What's your name?" Eddie asked. "Private James Rourke, sir." Eddie looked at the kid and saw himself at that age. Every mistake he'd ever made, every time he'd forced something that wasn't working, every moment of shame. "Rourke," he said quietly, "you just learned something more valuable than any manual can teach. You learned what happens when you force something that isn't ready." The kid's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I cost us a tank. I cost the invasion—" "You cost us 1 tank," Eddie interrupted, "but you're going to save the other 434. You're going to work with me for the next 12 hours. You're going to watch every repair I do, and you're going to make sure nobody else makes this mistake." Rourke stood up straighter. Eddie saw something shift in his face, shame transforming into determination. "Yes, sir." Torres pulled Eddie aside. "We're down to 1,999 operational tanks." Eddie checked his watch. 26 hours remaining. The math was getting tighter, but quitting wasn't an option. "Pull the fastest teams," he said. "Give them double shifts. We make up the time on volume." June 3rd, 2400 hours. Midnight. 24 hours into the operation. Eddie had been awake for 42 hours straight. His vision blurred, his back screamed, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a wrench. But he kept moving. The mechanics were past exhaustion, running on something deeper. DeLuca's hands were bleeding from wire brushwork, wrapped in bandages torn from his undershirt. Chen's face was gray with fatigue, but they kept working. "How many left?" Chen asked, his voice hoarse. 160? "We're going to make it." It wasn't optimism. It was a vow. Eddie gathered the team leaders at 0200 hours. They stood under the floodlights, looking like soldiers who just fought a battle. In a way, they had. 160 tanks remaining, Eddie said. 10 hours until loading begins. A British sergeant spoke up. "Mr. Kowalski, the men are spent. We need fresh crews." "There are no fresh crews." Eddie looked at each face. "I know you're tired. I know it hurts. But those tanks start loading in 10 hours, and every tank we haven't fixed is 5 men going into battle without the support we promised them." He paused, feeling the weight of it. "We've done the impossible for 24 hours. We're going to finish the impossible in the next 10. Nobody cheered. Nobody gave motivational speeches. They just nodded and went back to work. June 4th, 0600 hours. Dawn broke over Portsmouth. Eddie moved through the final tanks like a ghost, his body operating on muscle memory while his mind drifted. He found Rourke at Tank G, 923, working alone. The kid who'd stripped threads 22 hours ago had become one of the fastest mechanics in the yard. Redemption through precision. "How's it going?" Eddie asked. Rourke looked up, his young face aged by exhaustion and determination. 22 minutes. Perfect spring tension. Perfect clutch alignment. She'll run. Eddie checked the work. Flawless. "Good job, Rourke." The kid nodded, and for a moment Eddie saw something beautiful. Shame transformed into pride. By 11:30 hours, they were down to one tank. Tank Z999, the last Sherman in the yard. Every mechanic who could be spared had gathered to watch. Torres and DeLuca worked the final assembly while Eddie supervised. When Torres tightened the last bolt, the sound echoed like a gunshot. DeLuca climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 200 exhausted men just stood there, listening to the sound of an impossible promise kept. Eddie checked his watch. 1,142 hours, 18 minutes to spare. June 4th, 1400 hours. Eddie stood on the dock, watching the tanks roll onto landing craft. His tanks. The ones he'd spent 36 hours saving. Each Sherman carried 5 men who would never know their tank had been declared unfixable yesterday. 5 men who trusted their equipment would work when the ramp dropped. That trust felt heavier than anything Eddie had ever carried. General Bradley found him standing there. 847 tanks, 35 hours, 42 minutes. Eddie couldn't speak. If he opened his mouth, he might break. "I'm told you volunteered for combat duty," Bradley said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Eddie watched the tanks disappear into the ships. "Because if I'm wrong, I should be there. And if I'm right, maybe I can help." Bradley nodded slowly. "Third wave. We need you alive to fix tanks, not dead proving a point." "Yes, sir."